The morning sun cut through the blinds in Officer Richard Dawson's bedroom, creating strips of light across his face. He groaned and rolled over, his hand slapping the alarm clock that buzzed like an angry wasp. Another day on patrol in Oak Ridge waited for him. 15 years on the force had turned his once eager attitude into something harder, something colder. "Rich, coffee's ready," called his wife from downstairs. He shuffled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The mirror reflected a man in his 40s with deep lines around his eyes and a permanent furrow between his brows. As he buttoned his uniform, he felt the familiar weight of authority settle on his shoulders. Downstairs, his wife Linda placed a steaming mug and plate of toast in front of him. Their teenage daughter Kelly rushed through, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Late again," she mumbled, grabbing a piece of toast. "Bye, Dad. Remember what I told you?" Richard called after her. "Stay away from the south side after school," Linda sighed. "Rich, her study group meets at the library on the south side." "Then she should find another group," he said flatly, gulping his coffee. "That neighborhood isn't safe." What Richard didn't say, what he never said out loud, was that the South Side was predominantly black and Hispanic. In his mind, he had built walls of statistics and isolated incidents to justify his views. 15 years of policing had taught him to trust his gut, and his gut told him certain people were more likely to cause trouble. The drive to the station took him past neat suburban homes that gradually gave way to more diverse neighborhoods. Richard noticed everything: the group of young black men on a corner, the Hispanic workers waiting for day jobs, the white woman walking her dog without concern. In his mind, he was simply being observant, seeing patterns others were afraid to acknowledge. At the station, the morning briefing was led by their new police chief, Harriet Powell. 6 months into her role, she had already made changes that rubbed Richard the wrong way. "Before we get to assignments," Chief Powell announced, "I want to remind everyone that our community engagement initiative begins next week. The first bias training session is mandatory for all officers." A collective groan rippled through the room. Richard exchanged glances with his partner, Officer Tom Bailey. "Political correctness gone wild," Richard muttered under his breath. "I've heard your concerns," the chief continued, her gaze seeming to linger on Richard. "This isn't about politics. It's about effective policing. When our community trusts us, we can do our jobs better." Richard tuned out the rest of her speech. He'd been policing these streets since Powell was probably still in the academy. He didn't need some newcomer telling him how to do his job or what to think. "Dawson and Bailey, you've got patrol in sectors 4 and 6 today," the chief finished. As they headed to their squad car, Tom gave Richard a sideways look. "You know, maybe some of this training stuff isn't such a bad idea." Richard snorted. "You too? Look, I treat everyone the same. I go by behavior, not color." "Sure, but—" Tom hesitated. "You know that complaint last month? The professor you pulled over? He was doing 40 in a 30 zone, then got an attitude when I asked for his license. Before that, the teenager at the mall. He matched the description of a shoplifter." Tom fell silent as they got into the car. Richard knew what his partner was thinking, but didn't say. That the professor had been black. That the teenager had been Hispanic. That the attitude Richard perceived might have been simple nervousness. That the shoplifter description had been vague at best. Their patrol route took them through downtown Oak Ridge and into the surrounding neighborhoods. Richard drove, his eyes constantly scanning, his mind categorizing everyone he saw by level of threat. Young black male, watch closely. Group of Hispanic teenagers, circle back later. Well-dressed white woman, probably fine. In his mind, this wasn't racism. This was experience. This was knowing the streets. "Dispatch to Unit 17, the radio crackled. Unit 17, go ahead," Tom responded. "We've got a report of suspicious activity at the corner of Maple and 5th. Caller reports 2 individuals looking into car windows." "Copy that. We're 3 minutes out." Richard flipped on the siren and took the next turn sharply. As they approached the location, he spotted 2 young men walking slowly along the street. One wore a hoodie despite the warm weather. "There," he said, pointing. He pulled the car to the curb and was out the door before Tom could respond. Hand resting on his holstered weapon, Richard approached the pair. "Police! Stop right there and keep your hands where I can see them." The young men froze, hands rising slowly. Both were black, maybe in their early 20s. "What's going on, officer?" asked the one without the hoodie. His voice was steady, but Richard could see fear in his eyes. "We got a call about suspicious persons looking into vehicles." Richard said, his tone clipped. "What are you doing here?" "We live here," said Hoodie, gesturing to an apartment building across the street. "We're just walking home from the gym." Richard noticed the gym bags for the first time. Still, something felt off to him. "ID, both of you." Tom had joined him now, standing slightly back. Richard could sense his partner's unease. "Sir, may I ask why you need our ID?" the first young man asked. "We haven't done anything wrong." Richard stepped closer. "When an officer asks for identification, you provide it. That's the law. It wasn't exactly not without reasonable suspicion, but Richard had found that most people didn't know their rights well enough to challenge him." The young men exchanged glances, then slowly reached for their wallets. Richard noticed their college IDs as they handed them over. Darnell Washington and Lamont Turner, both students at Oak Ridge Community College. Richard ran their names through the system. Nothing came up. "What are you studying?" Tom asked conversationally while they waited. "Engineering," Darnell replied. "We both work part-time at the tech store in the mall, too." Richard handed back their IDs, his suspicion undiminished despite the clean check. "We've had reports of car break-ins in this area. If you live here, you should keep an eye out for actual suspicious activity." The emphasis on actual wasn't lost on the young men. They nodded, thanked the officers stiffly, and continued toward their building. Back in the car, Tom was quiet for a long moment. "You know, the caller probably saw two black guys walking down the street and assumed the worst, right? Or they saw something that didn't look right and called it in, which is what we tell people to do," Richard countered. "Better to check and find nothing than ignore something real." Tom shook his head but didn't push further. Later that afternoon, they responded to a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot. A white woman in an expensive SUV had backed into a sedan driven by a middle-aged black woman. By the time Richard and Tom arrived, the two were standing in the heat, the white woman gesturing emphatically. "She came out of nowhere," the SUV driver said immediately as Richard approached. "I looked in my mirrors and didn't see anyone." Richard nodded sympathetically, then turned to the other driver with a more neutral expression. "Your license and registration, please." The black woman frowned. "Shouldn't you ask both of us for that?" "I'll get to that," Richard said. "Your documents, please." As the woman reluctantly complied, Tom moved to speak with the SUV driver, quietly asking for her information as well. Richard didn't miss the pointed look his partner gave him. After taking statements and examining the minor damage, it was clear the SUV driver was at fault. Richard wrote up the report with barely concealed reluctance. "You're getting a citation for improper backing," he explained to the white woman, who looked surprised. "Really? I thought it would just be an insurance thing." "The law is the law," Richard said, though his tone was far gentler than it had been with the young men earlier. "Just be more careful next time." As they drove away, Tom broke their silence. "You know what Chief Powell would say about how you handled that." Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I handled it by the book. You asked for the black woman's documents first, like she was automatically at fault. Force of habit." "The report's accurate, isn't it?" Tom sighed. "That's not the point, Rich." But to Richard, that was exactly the point. The outcome was fair, regardless of how he got there. He didn't see the problem with using his experience to guide his approach. Some people were more likely to cause trouble than others. That was just reality as he saw it. As their shift neared its end, the radio came alive again. "All units in the vicinity of Oak Street and Wilson Avenue. We have reports of a disturbance at Wilson Park. Multiple callers." Richard flipped on the siren again and headed toward the park. A group had gathered around the basketball courts, voices raised. As they pulled up, Richard saw it was mostly black and Hispanic teenagers. "Let's break this up," he said to Tom, already reaching for his baton. Tom put a hand on his arm. "Let's see what's happening first." They approached the group, which quieted as the teens noticed them. Richard scanned their faces, looking for signs of trouble, anger, intoxication, defiance. "What's going on here?" he demanded. A tall black teenager stepped forward. "Nothing, sir. We were just playing ball and had a disagreement about the score." "A disagreement loud enough for people to call the police?" Richard asked skeptically. "It got a little heated," the teen admitted. "But we're working it out." Richard wasn't convinced. "IDs, all of you." The teens looked at each other uncertainly. There were about 12 of them. Tom stepped in. "Guys, we just need to make sure everyone's okay, and then we'll be on our way." Was it just a basketball argument, or is there something else we should know about? A different teen spoke up. Honestly, officer, it was just about a foul call. Got loud for a minute, but we're good now. Richard watched them closely, but saw nothing that suggested they were lying. Reluctantly, he backed down. Keep it down, he warned. Next time we might not be so understanding. As they walked back to the car, he could feel Tom's eyes on him. What? Richard snapped. Nothing, Tom said, but his expression said everything. Back at the station, Richard filled out his paperwork in tense silence. As he was preparing to leave, Chief Powell stopped by his desk. Dawson, got a minute? He followed her to her office, already defensive. I've been reviewing some statistics, she said once the door closed. Your stop rates for minority drivers are significantly higher than other officers in similar patrol sectors. Richard crossed his arms. I go where the trouble is. The data doesn't support that conclusion, she replied evenly. I'm not accusing you of anything, but I am asking you to come to the training with an open mind. With all due respect, Chief, I've been doing this job a long time. My instincts are good. Instincts can be valuable, she agreed. They can also be wrong. That's true for all of us. Richard left her office unconvinced. As he drove home, he passed the same neighborhoods, seeing the same things he always saw. Threats, problems, people to watch. In 15 years, his view of the world had narrowed to a series of risks to be managed, and he'd never once considered that the lens through which he viewed those risks might be distorted by something within himself. Not yet. Anyway, rain fell in sheets across Oak Ridge, turning the streets slick and dark. Richard Dawson sat in his patrol car, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm as he watched traffic crawl by. He'd been on duty for 10 hours already. His shift extended because another officer had called in sick. His back ached, his eyes burned, and his mood had soured with each passing hour. Dispatch to Unit 17, the radio crackled. Richard sighed and picked up. Unit 17, go ahead. Just checking in. Your shift was supposed to end 30 minutes ago. Still here, Richard replied. I'll make one more loop through Sector 6, then head in. Copy that. Be careful out there. Roads are getting bad. Richard pulled away from the curb, headlights cutting through the rain. His partner Tom had left 2 hours ago for a doctor's appointment, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. Sometimes he preferred it this way, no one questioning his methods or giving him sideways looks. He turned onto Maple Avenue, a winding road that connected the affluent north side with the more diverse south side neighborhoods. The rain was coming down harder now, visibility poor. Richard slowed as he approached an intersection, noticing a black sedan waiting at the red light. The car was nice, not luxury but well-maintained. As the light changed, the sedan moved forward, but its right turn signal came on late after it had already started the turn. Richard's eyes narrowed. A minor traffic violation, but a violation nonetheless. He flipped on his lights and followed. The sedan pulled over promptly, tires crunching on the wet gravel of the shoulder. Richard called in the stop, then grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the downpour. Water immediately began to seep through his uniform as he approached the driver's side. Flashlight beam pointed at the window. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a black man in his 50s dressed in a simple button-down shirt. His hair was cut short and neat with gray at the temples. He had a calm, dignified bearing that Richard immediately found suspicious. In his experience, people were usually nervous when pulled over, unless they had something to hide or thought they were above the law. License and registration, Richard said, not bothering with an explanation for the stop. The man looked at Richard directly. Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over? Richard's jaw tightened. License and registration first, then we'll get to that. Of course, the man said, his voice level. He reached slowly for the glove compartment, movements deliberate. I'm going to get my registration from the glove box, and my license is in my wallet in my back pocket. Richard watched every move with heightened attention, his free hand resting near his weapon. The man handed over a neatly organized insurance card and registration, then carefully extracted his license from his wallet. Richard examined the documents, the rain continuing to drip down his neck. The license identified the driver as Dr. Harold Washington. The address was in a wealthy suburb about 30 miles away. His record was clean, Dr. Washington, Richard said, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Where are you coming from tonight? I just flew into Oak Ridge International. I'm visiting my mother who lives on Elm Street. "And what kind of doctor are you?" Richard asked, deviating from standard procedure. A flash of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Dr. Washington's face before his expression returned to neutral. "I'm a rear admiral in the Navy, actually. The doctor is from my PhD in Naval Strategic Studies. I'm currently stationed at the Pentagon, but I'm on leave to visit family." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. The man wasn't what he'd expected, but years on the force had taught him that anyone could lie. He'd need to verify this story. "You failed to signal properly before turning," Richard said. "In this weather, that's dangerous." "I apologize if that's the case," Dr. Washington replied. "The rain makes visibility difficult." "Step out of the vehicle, please," Richard said suddenly. Dr. Washington's calm exterior cracked slightly. "Excuse me? For a turn signal violation?" "Sir, when an officer gives you an instruction, you need to comply." Richard's voice hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." A moment of tension hung between them. Then, with a small sigh, Dr. Washington unbuckled his seatbelt. "May I take my umbrella?" "It's pouring out there. Leave it. This won't take long if you cooperate." Dr. Washington stepped out into the rain, water immediately soaking into his clothes. He stood straight, hands visible at his sides. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Richard instructed. "Officer, is this really necessary?" Dr. Washington asked, still composed but with an edge of frustration creeping in. "I'm simply visiting my elderly mother." "Turn around," Richard repeated more forcefully this time. Reluctantly, Dr. Washington complied, placing his palms flat on the roof of his car. Richard began a pat-down, checking for weapons or contraband. He found nothing as expected. "Is there anything in the vehicle I should know about?" Richard asked. "Weapons, drugs?" Dr. Washington turned his head slightly. "No, officer. I don't possess such things." Richard stepped back. "Wait here." He returned to his patrol car with the license and registration, leaving Dr. Washington standing in the rain. Inside the dry confines of his vehicle, Richard ran a more thorough check. Everything came back clean. Dr. Harold Washington had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Richard frowned. He could write a citation for the turn signal and be done with it, but something about the man's composed demeanor irked him. People shouldn't be this calm when dealing with police. It suggested a lack of proper respect for authority. As Richard contemplated his next move, he noticed a car slow down as it passed. The driver seemed to be looking at the scene with unusual interest. A moment later, his radio came to life. "Dispatch to Unit 17. "Go ahead," Richard responded. "We just received a call from a concerned citizen about your traffic stop on Maple Avenue. Caller specifically mentioned the driver might be Rear Admiral Washington. Can you confirm the situation is under control?" Richard felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "Confirming situation normal. Routine traffic stop. Chief Powell is asking for an update. She's apparently acquainted with the Admiral." The cold feeling spread through Richard's chest. He looked through his windshield at the man still standing in the rain beside his car. Could he really be who he claimed? "Tell the chief everything's fine," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just finishing up now." He got out of his car and approached Dr. Washington again, this time with a very different demeanor. "You can get back in your vehicle, sir," he said, holding out the documents. "Just a warning about the turn signal tonight." Dr. Washington took his license and registration, his clothes now thoroughly soaked. "Thank you, officer. Am I free to go?" "Yes, sir." "Drive safely." Richard took a step back, ready to retreat to his patrol car. Dr. Washington paused before getting in. "Officer, may I have your name and badge number?" Richard stiffened. "Officer Richard Dawson, badge number 4278. "Thank you." "Officer Dawson." With that, Dr. Washington got into his car and carefully pulled away. Richard stood in the rain for a moment longer, a sense of unease growing in his stomach. He returned to his patrol car and sat with his hands on the steering wheel, not moving. His radio crackled again. "Unit 17, Chief Powell requests you return to the station immediately." "Copy that," Richard said, his mouth dry. "On my way." The station was quiet when Richard arrived. The evening shift settled into their routines. He made his way to the chief's office, still in his wet uniform. The door was open, and inside he found Chief Powell standing with another officer, Lieutenant Wilson, who had served in the Navy before joining the police force. "Come in." "Dawson," Chief Powell said, her expression unreadable. "Close the door." Richard did as instructed, standing at attention before her desk. "I understand you pulled over a black sedan on Maple Avenue earlier," she began. "Yes, ma'am. Minor traffic violation. I gave the driver a warning and sent him on his way." Lieutenant Wilson made a sound somewhere between a cough and a laugh. Chief Powell shot him a look before turning back to Richard. "That driver," she said carefully, "was Rear Admiral Harold Washington. Not only is he currently being considered for appointment as the next Chief of Naval Operations, but he also happens to be Lieutenant Wilson's former commanding officer." Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. "He mentioned he was in the Navy, but I had to verify." "According to my information," Chief Powell cut in, "you had him standing in the rain while you ran a check that showed he had a spotless record. You also subjected him to a search without probable cause." "I was following procedure for an out-of-town vehicle," Richard protested weakly. "Were you?" Chief Powell asked. "Because our procedure doesn't involve having drivers exit their vehicles for minor traffic violations." Richard remained silent, his usual confidence deserting him. "Admiral Washington has already called the mayor," Lieutenant Wilson added. "They served together on a committee years ago. The mayor called me, knowing my Navy background, to confirm if it was the same Harold Washington." "It is." The implications hit Richard like a physical blow. This wasn't some random traffic stop that would be forgotten by morning. This had reached the highest levels of both the city government and the police department in less than an hour. "Admiral Washington has requested a meeting," Chief Powell continued. "Not to file a complaint, which he would be well within his rights to do, but to discuss the incident. He specifically asked that you be present." Richard swallowed hard. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Chief Powell leaned forward. "I don't need to tell you how serious this is, Dawson. The Admiral is a highly respected military officer with an impeccable record of service to this country. The way you treated him tonight reflects not just on you but on this entire department." "I was just doing my job," Richard said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Were you?" Chief Powell asked, her gaze piercing. "Or were you doing something else? Something we're going to be discussing at length in that bias training you've been so eager to dismiss?" Richard had no answer. The rain had finally stopped outside, but the storm in his professional life was just beginning to gather force. "Go home, Dawson," Chief Powell said finally. "Get some dry clothes. Think about how you want tomorrow's meeting to go, because I can tell you this. Admiral Washington isn't someone who achieved his position without being an excellent judge of character. He's going to see right through any excuse you might be thinking of offering." Richard nodded stiffly and turned to leave. "And Dawson," the chief added as he reached for the door, "this may be the most important meeting of your career. I suggest you come prepared to listen rather than defend." As Richard drove home through the clearing night, the streets glistening under the streetlights, he felt something he rarely experienced: doubt. For the first time in many years, he questioned whether his instincts, the ones he'd relied on so heavily, might have led him astray. The thought was deeply uncomfortable, like a pebble in his shoe that couldn't be ignored. He pulled into his driveway, noticing the lights still on in his house. Linda would be waiting up, probably worried about him working late in the storm. How would he explain what had happened tonight? How could he make her understand that his entire career might now be hanging in the balance because of a traffic stop that had gone terribly wrong? Richard sat in his car for a long moment. Rain no longer falling, but the weight of the coming storm pressing down on him all the same. Richard arrived at the station 30 minutes early the next morning, his uniform pressed to perfection, shoes polished to a mirror shine. He'd barely slept. Linda had known something was wrong the moment he walked through the door last night, his face drawn and shoulders slumped. He'd told her everything, expecting support or at least understanding. Instead, she'd listened quietly, then asked a simple question that had kept him awake most of the night. "Would you have treated him the same way if he was white?" He sat in the break room now, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted like ashes in his mouth. A few officers came and went, eyeing him curiously. Word had spread quickly about what had happened. In a department this size, secrets didn't last long. Tom appeared in the doorway, hesitating before approaching. "Morning." Richard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Heard about what happened," Tom said, lowering his voice as he sat down. Tough break, is that what this is? Richard asked. A tough break? Tom studied him for a moment. You know, I've been trying to tell you for months that you've been crossing lines. Not because I'm some bleeding heart, but because I could see this coming. Richard stared into his coffee. You think I'm going to lose my job? I think you've got an opportunity here, Tom replied. The Admiral requested a meeting instead of filing a complaint. That says something. Like what? Like maybe he sees something worth salvaging. Tom checked his watch. It's time. Chief's office. Richard walked alongside his partner, aware of the eyes following him through the bullpen. His mouth was dry, his collar suddenly too tight. He'd faced armed suspects with less anxiety than he felt approaching the chief's office now. Chief Powell's door was closed. Tom gave him an encouraging nod, then left him to face the music alone. Richard knocked, his knuckles sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. Come in, called the chief. Richard entered to find Chief Powell seated behind her desk. Across from her sat the man from last night, Rear Admiral Harold Washington. In the bright office light, Richard could see him clearly for the first time. The Admiral wore a tailored navy blue suit, a small American flag pin on his lapel. His bearing was military straight, but his expression was thoughtful rather than angry. A third chair waited empty, obviously meant for Richard. Officer Dawson, Chief Powell said formally. Thank you for joining us. I believe you've met Rear Admiral Washington. Richard nodded stiffly. Sir, please have a seat, the Admiral said. His voice deep and measured. Richard sat down, hyper-aware of his breathing, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint sounds of the station beyond the closed door. Admiral Washington has kindly agreed to speak with us this morning about last night's incident, Chief Powell began. As I mentioned, he's chosen not to file a formal complaint at this time. Richard felt a flicker of hope at the words, at this time. Before we begin, the chief continued, I want to make it clear that this conversation is being recorded, and anything discussed may become part of your personnel file, Officer Dawson. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Chief Powell nodded to the Admiral, yielding the floor. Officer Dawson, Admiral Washington began, I'd like to start by asking you a simple question. Why did you pull me over last night? Richard had prepared for this. You made a turn without proper signal indication, sir. In those weather conditions, it presented a safety hazard. The Admiral nodded. A turn signal violation. And in your experience as a police officer, does that typically warrant having the driver exit the vehicle and submit to a search? Richard felt heat rising in his face. I was following procedure for suspicious circumstances, sir. What were those suspicious circumstances exactly? The question hung in the air. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? That a well-dressed black man in a nice car seemed out of place? That the Admiral's calm demeanor had seemed suspicious? I'm waiting, officer, the Admiral said quietly. I made a judgment call based on my experience, Richard said finally. I see. Admiral Washington leaned forward slightly. You know, in the Navy we have a saying, perception is not reality. Our perceptions are filtered through our experiences, our biases, our fears. Sometimes what we think we see isn't what's actually there. Richard remained silent, unsure how to respond. I've commanded ships with crews of over 5,000 sailors, the Admiral continued, men and women of every race, religion, and background. Do you know what I learned about judgment calls, Officer Dawson? No, sir. I learned that when my judgment was clouded by preconceptions, people died. The Admiral's voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of terrible experience. During my second command, we were conducting operations in the Persian Gulf. A young black ensign, brilliant kid, top of his class at Annapolis, reported an anomaly in some intelligence data. My executive officer dismissed it. Do you know why? Richard shook his head. Because he didn't think a 22-year-old black kid from Detroit could spot something that the veteran analysts had missed. He assumed the ensign was trying to show off, to prove himself. The Admiral paused. 3 sailors died because of that assumption. Because my XO couldn't see past the color of that young man's skin to recognize his competence. The office fell silent. Even Chief Powell seemed affected by the story. I don't share that to make you feel guilty, Officer Dawson, the Admiral said after a moment. I share it because I recognized something in you last night that reminded me of my old XO. The certainty. The unwillingness to question your own perceptions. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. With all due respect, sir, policing is different from military operations. We have to make split-second decisions based on limited information. True, the Admiral acknowledged, but that makes it even more important to examine the filters through which you process that limited information. Last night, what information did you actually have about me when you decided I was suspicious? The question struck Richard like a physical blow. He'd had the license and registration showing a clean record. He'd had the Admiral's explanation for being in town. Nothing in those facts had suggested danger or criminal activity. I didn't have much, Richard admitted reluctantly. And yet you proceeded as if I represented a threat, the Admiral said. Why do you think that is? Before Richard could formulate a response, there was a knock at the door. Chief Powell called for the person to enter. Lieutenant Wilson stepped in, followed by an older black woman leaning on a cane. She was small, probably in her 80s, with bright eyes and a dignified presence that immediately commanded attention. I'm sorry to interrupt, Lieutenant Wilson said, but Mrs. Washington insisted on being part of this meeting. The Admiral stood immediately. Mother, you didn't need to come down here. Hush, Harold, the elderly woman said, waving away his concern. When my son tells me he's been mistreated by the police in my own neighborhood, you better believe I'm going to have something to say about it. Chief Powell rose as well. Mrs. Washington, we're in the middle of a— I know exactly what you're in the middle of, Mrs. Washington interrupted. And I think you need to hear from someone who's lived in this town for 63 years. She turned her piercing gaze on Richard. You must be Officer Dawson. Richard stood awkwardly. Yes, ma'am. Sit down, young man. All of you, sit down. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I'm not talking to the tops of your heads. They all obeyed. Lieutenant Wilson bringing in an extra chair for Mrs. Washington. Once settled, she fixed Richard with a look that reminded him powerfully of his own grandmother. Do you know where I live, Officer Dawson? She asked. No, ma'am. 1247 Elm Street. The blue house with the rose garden? I've lived there since 1962. Do you know how many times I've been pulled over driving in my own neighborhood? Richard shook his head. 17 times. I kept count. 17 times in 63 years and never once got a ticket. Just routine stops, they said. She leaned forward. My late husband was a postal worker for 40 years. Never missed a day. We raised 4 children in that house. Harold here was our youngest. The others are a doctor, a teacher, and a judge. She paused, letting her words sink in. We did everything right. Worked hard, followed the rules, taught our children to respect authority, and still, when my son comes to visit his mama, he gets treated like a criminal. Richard looked down at his hands. Mrs. Washington, I'm not finished, she said firmly. I watched the civil rights movement from my living room window. I saw this town change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But what hasn't changed enough is how some police officers see us. How they see my son even in a nice car, even with all his accomplishments, even with all those stars on his uniform. The Admiral put a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. Mother, it's okay. It's not okay, she replied, but her voice softened. But it could be if people were willing to learn. She turned back to Richard. My Harold didn't want to file a complaint against you. Know why? Richard shook his head again. Because he believes people can change. He's seen it happen. So have I. Mrs. Washington's expression softened slightly. The question is, Officer Dawson, are you willing to learn? The room fell silent. Richard felt as if every mistake, every questionable stop, every assumption he'd made in his 15 years on the force was laid bare before him. He thought of the teenagers at the basketball court, the young men walking home from the gym, the countless traffic stops where he'd treated people differently based on nothing more than their appearance. I don't know, he said honestly. This is all I know. This is how I was trained. No, Chief Powell cut in sharply. You were not trained to profile citizens based on race. You were trained to serve and protect all citizens equally. But the statistics, Richard began, can be manipulated to confirm whatever bias you already hold, the Admiral finished for him. I have a PhD in strategic studies, Officer Dawson. I know how data can be misused. Lieutenant Wilson, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward. When I served under Admiral Washington, I was the only white officer in my division for a while. I thought I understood discrimination before that. I didn't have a clue until I experienced being the only one who looked like me in the room. It changed my perspective completely. Richard looked at the faces around him. the chief's stern professionalism, the admiral's dignified calm, Mrs. Washington's hard-earned wisdom, and the lieutenant's earnest openness. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider that he might be wrong. "I'm not a bad cop," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never used excessive force. I've never planted evidence. I've always thought I was doing the right thing." "I believe you," the admiral said, surprising Richard. "Most prejudice isn't born from hatred. It's born from fear, from misunderstanding, from the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world." He paused. "The question is whether you're willing to consider a different story." Richard looked up, meeting the admiral's steady gaze. "What happens now?" Chief Powell answered. "That depends on you, Officer Dawson. Admiral Washington has offered an alternative to formal disciplinary action." "What alternative?" Richard asked, a mixture of hope and wariness in his voice. The admiral explained. "I'm in town for 2 weeks visiting my mother. During that time, I'd like you to meet with me, not as an officer and a suspect, but as two men trying to understand each other better. No recording devices, no official reports. Just conversation." Richard frowned in confusion. "You want to talk to me?" "After how I treated you." "Especially after how you treated me," the admiral replied. "Because that treatment didn't come from nowhere, and it won't go away with punishment alone." Mrs. Washington reached out and patted Richard's hand, a gesture so unexpected that he nearly pulled away. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, young man. Even stubborn old police officers." For the first time since entering the office, Richard felt a small smile tug at his lips. "I'm not that old, ma'am." "You're not that young either," she retorted with a twinkle in her eye. Chief Powell cleared her throat. "This is unconventional, but so is the admiral's decision not to file a complaint. I'm willing to suspend any departmental action pending the outcome of these conversations. But, Officer Dawson, this is your only chance. Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Richard said, the full weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. His career, his identity as a police officer, perhaps even his understanding of himself, all hung in the balance. The admiral stood, extending his hand. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m. at my mother's house. We'll have coffee and conversation." Richard rose and took the offered hand, feeling as though he stood at a crossroads. "I'll be there, sir." As he left the chief's office, the station seemed different somehow, as if he were seeing it through new eyes. Officers went about their duties, phones rang. Life continued as normal, but Richard Dawson had begun to change, whether he was ready for it or not. The revelation wasn't just that he had stopped a highly decorated naval officer. It was the dawning recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, the lens through which he viewed the world was distorted, and had been for a very long time. Richard sat in his car outside the blue house with the rose garden, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He'd been there for 10 minutes already, unable to make himself walk up the neat concrete path to the front door. It was 5 minutes to 3. He was never late for appointments, being punctual was a point of pride for him, but today he considered driving away. What was he doing here? Having coffee with a man he'd wrongfully treated like a criminal just days ago? The whole situation felt surreal. A tap on his window startled him. Mrs. Washington stood there, gardening gloves on her hands, a knowing smile on her face. Richard quickly rolled down his window. "Thinking of making a run for it?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with unexpected humor. Richard felt his face grow warm. "No, ma'am, just gathering my thoughts." "Thoughts can be gathered inside just as well as in a car," she replied. "Come on now. Harold's waiting, and I made lemon cake." Somehow the mention of cake broke the tension. Richard found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "Yes, ma'am." He followed Mrs. Washington up the path, noting the carefully tended roses that lined it. The house was modest but immaculately maintained, with fresh paint and polished brass fixtures. Inside, the home smelled of lemon and cinnamon, with furniture that looked well loved but cared for. Family photos covered the walls, graduations, weddings, military ceremonies. Admiral Washington stood as they entered, dressed in civilian clothes, khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt. Without his uniform, he looked like any other man in his 50s except for his perfect posture and alert eyes. "Officer Dawson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Just Richard is fine," Richard replied, shaking the offered hand. It felt strange to be addressed by his title in this setting. "Then I'm Harold," the Admiral said. "Please have a seat." Mrs. Washington disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a tray bearing coffee, cake, and an assortment of cookies. "You boys talk. I'll be in the garden if you need me." After she left, an awkward silence fell. Richard stared at his coffee cup, unsure how to begin. "Do you have children, Richard?" Harold asked suddenly. Richard looked up, surprised by the question. "A daughter, Kelly. She's 16. Harold nodded. "Tough age. My son just turned 28. Naval Academy graduate, following in the old man's footsteps. I wasn't sure I wanted that for him." "Why not?" Richard asked before he could stop himself. "You've had an impressive career." "I have," Harold agreed. "But I've also had experiences I wouldn't wish on anyone. Being the only black officer in a room full of skeptical faces, having my competence questioned at every turn, being mistaken for kitchen staff while in uniform at official functions." He paused, being pulled over for driving while black. Richard winced. "About that," Harold held up a hand. "We'll get there. But first I want to know about you. 15 years on the force, the chief told me. What made you become a police officer?" The question caught Richard off guard. He'd expected accusations, maybe a lecture, not genuine interest in his life. "My father was a cop," he said after a moment, "and his father before him. Family tradition, I guess. I always looked up to my dad, saw how people respected him. He was old school, tough but fair, that's what everyone said." "And you wanted to be like him," Harold observed. "I did. Still do, I suppose." Richard took a sip of his coffee. "He died 5 years ago. Heart attack. I'm sorry for your loss." Richard nodded his thanks. "What about you? What led you to the Navy?" A small smile played across Harold's face. "Would you believe it was a recruiting poster? I was 17 growing up right here in this house. One day I saw this poster of a Navy officer standing on the bridge of a ship. There was something about the dignity of it, the sense of purpose." His expression grew more serious. "And honestly, I wanted out of Oak Ridge. The 1980s weren't exactly progressive times in this town." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "It's changed a lot since then, has it?" Harold asked quietly. "Or have some things just become less visible, less obvious?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard found he couldn't meet Harold's gaze. "Let's talk about the other night," Harold said finally. "I'd like you to walk me through what happened from your perspective. Not the official report. What you were thinking. What you were feeling." Richard took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been dreading, but also the reason he'd come. "I was tired. End of a long shift in bad weather. I saw your turn signal come on late, and I decided to pull you over." "Why?" Harold pressed. "A late turn signal in the rain isn't exactly a major violation." "It's still a violation," Richard said defensively, then caught himself. "But you're right. I probably wouldn't have stopped most drivers for that. I saw a black man in a nice car in an area that's mostly white, and I was curious." "Curious," Harold repeated. "Go on." "When I approached your window, you asked why I pulled you over instead of just complying with my request for license and registration. That struck me as suspicious. Why?" Richard hesitated. "Because in my experience, people who have nothing to hide just do what they're told. Or people who are tired of being unfairly targeted might question why they're being stopped," Harold suggested. "Maybe," Richard conceded. "Anyway, when you said you were a doctor and an admiral, I didn't believe you. It seemed unlikely." "Because of how I look?" Harold asked, his voice still remarkably free of anger. Richard wanted to deny it, but he forced himself to be honest. "Yes. I've arrested people before who made up elaborate stories. I thought you were trying to intimidate me with a fake status. So you ordered me out of the car and searched me." "Yes. How did you feel when you found out who I really was?" Richard winced at the memory. "Embarrassed. Worried about my job, but not wrong?" Harold pressed. Richard struggled with the words. "I followed procedure." Harold leaned forward. "Richard, we both know that's not true. What you did wasn't procedure. It was prejudice." The blunt statement hit Richard like a physical blow. His first instinct was to argue, to defend himself, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the lack of hostility in Harold's tone, or maybe it was simply exhaustion from carrying the weight of his defenses for so long. "You're right," he said finally, the admission surprisingly freeing. "I made assumptions based on race. I've been doing it for years. We all have, most of the guys on the force. We just call it experience or instinct instead of what it really is." Harold nodded, his expression softening. That's a hard truth to face. I respect your honesty. Don't, Richard said sharply. I don't deserve respect for admitting something I should have recognized a long time ago. Self-awareness is always worthy of respect, no matter when it arrives, Harold replied. The question is what you do with it now. Richard ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. I can't just change overnight. These patterns of thinking, they're deep. Of course they are. No one's asking you to change overnight. Change is a journey, not an event. But my job is to protect and serve everyone equally, Harold finished for him. Can you do that? I want to, Richard said honestly. But I'm not sure I know how anymore. Harold stood up. Come with me. I want to show you something. Curious, Richard followed him down a hallway to what appeared to be a small home office. On the wall hung numerous awards, commendations, and photographs. Harold pointed to one showing a much younger version of himself standing next to a white naval officer. This is Commander William Reynolds, Harold explained. My first commanding officer. He was from rural Georgia, raised in a segregated community with all the prejudices you'd expect. When I was assigned to his ship as a young ensign, he called me into his office. Harold's voice took on a storyteller's rhythm. He sat me down and said, Washington, I'm going to be honest with you. I've never had a black officer under my command before, and I've got some biases I was raised with. They're wrong, but they're there. I'm telling you this because I don't want those biases to affect how I treat you, so I'm asking for your help. If you ever feel I'm not giving you a fair shake, I want you to call me on it. Richard stared at the photograph. He just admitted it. Just like that? Just like that, Harold confirmed. It was the most refreshing moment of my young career. Not because he had biases, everyone does, but because he acknowledged them and was actively working to overcome them. He became my greatest mentor and later recommended me for my first command. What happened to him? Retired as an admiral himself. Still calls me every month. Came to my son's graduation. Harold turned to face Richard directly. That's why I wanted to talk with you instead of filing a complaint. I saw in you what Commander Reynolds must have seen in himself, someone capable of being better than their biases. Richard felt a lump forming in his throat. I'm not sure I deserve that kind of faith. It's not about deserving, Harold said simply. It's about potential. Everyone has the potential to grow, to change, to become more than what they've been. They returned to the living room, where Mrs. Washington had quietly replaced their coffee with fresh cups. She gave Richard a gentle smile before disappearing again. I want to tell you about the first time I was stopped by police, Harold said as they sat back down. I was 16, riding my bike home from a friend's house. 2 officers pulled up beside me, asked what I was doing in this neighborhood. I explained I lived 3 blocks away. They didn't believe me. Richard listened, a sick feeling growing in his stomach as Harold recounted being handcuffed, put in the back of a police car, and driven home to verify his story. When they saw my mother at the door, they tried to play it off as concern for my safety. Harold continued, but we both knew what it really was. Did you hate the police after that? Richard asked, No, I hated what they did, not who they were. That's an important distinction, Richard. I don't hate you. I hate the system that taught you to see me as a threat before you saw me as a person. How do you not hate me? Richard asked, genuinely puzzled. If someone had treated my daughter the way I treated you, I was angry, Harold admitted. Still am to some degree. But hate doesn't create change. Conversation does. Understanding does. So what now? Richard asked. We've talked. I've admitted I was wrong. Where does that leave us? Harold considered the question. That depends on you. I'm here for 2 weeks. I propose we meet like this every other day, not just to talk about what happened, but to get to know each other as people. Break down those walls of assumption and replace them with knowledge. And then you take what you've learned back to your job. Maybe you share it with others. Maybe you become the Commander Reynolds of the Oak Ridge Police Department. Richard let out a short laugh. I'm not exactly leadership material. Neither was I until someone believed I could be, Harold countered. This isn't just about making you feel bad for what happened. It's about creating something positive from it. As Richard drove home later that evening, his mind was spinning with new thoughts and perspectives. He'd expected recrimination, not conversation. Punishment, not opportunity. The weight on his shoulders felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but more balanced. As if he'd been carrying it all on one side for years without realizing it. Linda was waiting when he got home, curiosity written across her face. "How did it go?" Richard took a moment to find the right words. "It was unexpected. He's not what I thought he'd be." "In what way?" "He's tough but fair," Richard said, suddenly reminded of how people had described his father. "He didn't let me off the hook, but he didn't try to bury me either. He wants to talk more, to help me understand." "And do you want that?" Linda asked carefully. Richard thought about the Admiral's story, about Commander Reynolds and his remarkable honesty, about the 16-year-old boy handcuffed for riding his bike in his own neighborhood, about his own daughter, and what kind of world he wanted for her. "Yes," he said finally, "I think I do." That night Richard dreamed of standing on the bridge of a ship, looking out over vast waters. Beside him stood Harold Washington, pointing toward the horizon. "Navigation is about knowing where you are," the Admiral said in the dream, "but also about knowing where you're going. You can't change course if you don't admit you're headed in the wrong direction." Richard woke with those words echoing in his mind, the dawn light just beginning to filter through the blinds. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something unexpected. Hope. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when Richard Dawson pulled over Admiral Harold Washington. 6 months of conversations that had started awkwardly in Mrs. Washington's living room and gradually expanded to walks through the neighborhood, lunch at local restaurants, and even a fishing trip to the lake outside town. 6 months of hard questions and harder answers, of stories shared and perspectives challenged. When the Admiral returned to Washington, D.C. after his 2-week visit, their talks had continued by phone every Sunday evening. Richard had come to look forward to these calls, not just for the guidance Harold provided, but for the friendship that had unexpectedly developed between them. Today, Richard stood in front of the mirror in the men's room at the Oak Ridge Community Center, straightening his tie. The department had given him permission to wear his dress uniform for this occasion, and he wanted everything to be perfect. His hands trembled slightly as he made a final adjustment to his collar. The door swung open and Chief Powell entered. She'd been a constant, if sometimes stern, supporter of Richard's journey over the past 6 months. "Nervous?" she asked, noticing his shaking hands. "Terrified," Richard admitted. "What if I mess this up?" "You won't," she said with unexpected gentleness. "You've put in the work, Dawson. Trust that?" Richard nodded, taking a deep breath. "Is the Admiral here?" "Just arrived with his mother. The mayor's with them." Chief Powell checked her watch. 5 minutes until we start." The room's filling up fast. Richard felt another wave of anxiety. "I didn't expect so many people to come." "What you've helped build here matters to this community," the chief replied. "People want to be part of it." She left him alone with his thoughts. Richard looked at himself one last time in the mirror. The face that stared back was the same one he'd seen every day for 45 years. But the eyes held something different now, a clarity, a purpose that hadn't been there before. The community center's main hall was indeed packed when Richard finally walked in. Rows of chairs had been arranged facing a small stage, most already filled with community members, fellow officers, local business owners, and families from all parts of Oak Ridge. Richard recognized faces from the South Side neighborhoods he had once viewed with such suspicion, now looking at him with cautious hope rather than fear. In the front row sat Admiral Washington in his full dress uniform, medals glinting under the lights. Beside him, Mrs. Washington beamed proudly. They had become like family to Richard over these months, their home a place of both challenging growth and warm acceptance. Richard made his way to the stage, where the mayor was already speaking, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Community Policing Initiative, a new approach to law enforcement in Oak Ridge that emphasizes partnership over punishment, understanding over enforcement, and community over division. The mayor turned as Richard approached. "And here's the officer who, along with Admiral Washington, developed this groundbreaking program. Please welcome Officer Richard Dawson." The applause was polite but reserved as Richard took his place at the podium. He'd expected that. Trust wasn't built with words but actions, and the community had good reason to be skeptical. That's why today mattered so much. Richard cleared his throat, looking down at the notes he'd prepared but finding himself setting them aside. This wasn't a moment for rehearsed remarks. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I pulled over a car for a minor traffic violation. The driver was Admiral Harold Washington. He gestured toward Harold, who nodded encouragingly. I treated him with suspicion and disrespect, not because of anything he did, but because of assumptions I made based on the color of his skin. Richard paused, letting the uncomfortable truth hang in the air. I'd like to tell you this was an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment, but that would be a lie. A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the typical public relations speech they'd expected. For 15 years, I policed this community through a lens of bias I didn't even recognize. I saw threats where there were only neighbors. I saw criminals where there were only citizens. I wasn't protecting and serving everyone equally. I was protecting some from others. Richard looked directly at the diverse faces before him. I'm not sharing this to ask for forgiveness. I'm sharing it because acknowledging the problem is the first step toward fixing it. And that's what the Community Policing Initiative is about. Fixing a broken approach to law enforcement. He explained the program's three main components. Education for officers about implicit bias and community history. Partnership with neighborhood leaders to identify actual problems rather than perceived ones. And accountability through civilian oversight and transparent data collection. But this isn't just about changing policies. Richard continued. It's about changing hearts and minds, beginning with my own. He looked toward Harold. Admiral Washington could have filed a complaint against me. He could have demanded my badge. Instead, he offered something much harder. Conversation. Understanding. The chance to confront my own prejudice and grow beyond it. Richard gripped the edges of the podium. I won't stand here and tell you I'm completely free of bias now. 6 months can't undo a lifetime. But I can tell you I'm aware of it now. I question my assumptions. I check my instincts against facts. And most importantly, I see people as individuals, not categories. As he spoke, Richard noticed Tom and several other officers nodding, while others looked uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort was part of growth. He'd learned that lesson well. Some of you may be wondering why you should trust this initiative. Or me, given my history. Richard acknowledged. That's fair. Trust is earned through actions, not words. That's why the Community Policing Initiative includes measurable goals and regular public reporting. We'll be judged by results, not intentions. He gestured to a table at the side of the room where information packets were stacked. These contain the full details of the program, including how citizens can participate in oversight committees. We need your involvement to make this work. Richard took a deep breath before his conclusion. I've been a police officer for over 15 years. But I'm just now learning what it truly means to serve and protect all citizens equally. I'm asking for the chance to show you what that looks like in practice. Not because I deserve it, but because this community deserves nothing less. As Richard stepped back from the podium, the applause was still restrained, but it felt more genuine now. He hadn't expected cheers. This wasn't that kind of moment. What mattered was the thoughtful expressions, the considering nods, the quiet conversations already beginning among audience members. The mayor returned to introduce Admiral Washington, who rose to speak about his involvement in the initiative. As Harold passed Richard on his way to the podium, he squeezed his shoulder in a gesture of support that meant more to Richard than any official commendation ever had. The formal presentation ended with a question and answer session, followed by refreshments and an invitation for community members to speak directly with the officers involved in the program. Richard found himself surrounded by people with pointed questions, skeptical comments, and occasionally, words of encouragement. An elderly black man approached, studying Richard's face carefully. I remember you, he said. You pulled over my grandson last year, made him late for his college interview. Richard felt a flush of shame. I'm sorry, truly. Words are easy, the man replied. What's different now? It was a fair question, one Richard had asked himself many times. I can't change what I did, he said honestly, but I can change what I do from here forward. I can work to make sure other young men don't have the same experience your grandson had. The man nodded slowly. My grandson got into that college despite being rattled by your stop. He's studying criminal justice. He sounds like someone we need in the field, Richard said. Maybe so. The man handed Richard a business card. That's my contact information. I'd like to be on one of these oversight committees. Keep you honest. Richard took the card with genuine appreciation. I'd welcome that, sir. As the event wound down, Richard found himself standing with Harold, Mrs. Washington, and Chief Powell near the refreshment table. "You did well," Harold said. "That couldn't have been easy." "Hardest thing I've ever done," Richard admitted. "But necessary." Mrs. Washington patted his arm. "Growth never comes from comfortable places, young man." Chief Powell nodded toward the dispersing crowd. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts tomorrow when you're back on patrol." "I know," Richard said. "But for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to the job rather than just going through the motions." Later that evening, Richard sat on his back porch, replaying the day's events. Linda brought him a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside him. "How do you feel?" she asked. Richard considered the question carefully. "Like I've finally started doing the job I swore to do 15 years ago." "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Kelly is too." She told her friends her dad is woke now. Linda smiled. "I think that's a compliment," Richard laughed. "I'll take it, though I've got a long way to go before I earn that label." His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Most of the guys are talking about your speech. Some good, some bad, but they're talking. That's something." It was something indeed. Change wouldn't happen overnight. Not for the department, not for the community, and not for Richard himself. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. Old habits of thought would resurface, requiring constant vigilance. But as Richard looked up at the stars appearing in the evening sky, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The weight of maintaining his defenses, of justifying his actions, of refusing to question his assumptions, it had been exhausting in ways he hadn't even recognized until that burden began to lift. The next morning, Richard rose before dawn and put on his uniform with a sense of purpose. As he drove to the station, he passed through the same neighborhoods he'd patrolled for years, but he saw them differently now. The young men on the corner weren't threats to be managed, but citizens to be served. The diversity of the South Side wasn't a problem to be contained, but a community to be protected. At roll call, Chief Powell announced the official launch of the Community Policing Initiative and the officers who would be participating in the first phase. When she called Richard's name to lead the program, there were a few grumbles and eye rolls, but also several supportive nods. "This won't be easy," the chief concluded. "Change never is. But it's necessary, and it starts with each of us examining our own approach to the job." As Richard headed out to his patrol car, Tom fell into step beside him. "So, partner, what does community policing look like in practice?" Richard thought of all he'd learned from Harold, from Mrs. Washington, from the community members he'd met yesterday. "It looks like treating everyone with the same respect we'd want for ourselves or our families. It looks like questioning our assumptions before we act on them. It looks like remembering why we took this job in the first place, to help people, all people." Tom nodded slowly. "I can get behind that." Richard smiled as they got into the car. "Let's show them what good policing really looks like." As they drove through the morning streets of Oak Ridge, Richard felt the weight of his badge differently, not as a shield that separated him from those he served, but as a symbol of a responsibility to serve everyone with equal justice and dignity. The transformation wasn't complete, would never be complete, but it had begun in earnest. And that was enough for today.